Right, so I'm back here with Mike Morgan from Peterson Fluid Systems, and so now we're going to talk about dry sumps. So we've talked about wet sumps and some ways to modify a wet sump system to improve its performance. If that is too limiting, the next step would be a dry sump system.
Dry sump, yep.
So what is a dry sump? What is the biggest difference between those two?
Well, the biggest difference is where you hold the oil, like we talked about before. So in a dry sump system, you maintain the majority of your oil in an external tank, like this one. This is one of our drag racing tanks. It's about 1.5 gallons, 2 gallons capacity. So
what is like your largest tank?
Our largest, I mean, we've built tanks that are 6 gallons for NASCAR.
Wow.
Because NASCAR, they're running long races, and so they tend to burn off some oil gets lost. So the other benefit of running a larger tank in that situation is to keep the oil cooler.
Gotcha.
Because it has some chance to offload some heat when it's sitting in the tank. And
because you're putting it in this big tank, there's no reason that this has to be in the engine bay, right? This can actually be remote mounted.
No, yeah, you can move, the benefit of this is you can move this where it makes best sense for weight. We have a lot of road racing cars and stuff that will actually put this maybe behind where the passenger seat would be to offload, offset the weight of the driver so they have a better weight distribution in the car.
Sure, and just as a quick math thing here, so like that NASCAR tank that's 6 gallons, that's 24 quarts. So that's substantially more oil than what you're probably going to fit in your stock oil pan.
Yeah.
So a lot more volume and a lot more capacity to the system. First, what is that?
This over here is a dry sump pump.
Okay.
So this is an oil pump, external obviously, that you would mount to your engine. It has one pressure section, so this is typically what's in a car, or what we talked about a wet sump. This is the pressure section that's going to take the oil from here, put it into the motor.
Okay.
This is what we would call a 4-stage. So it's 1 stage of pressure, 3 of scavenge. So typically these 3 would then go to the oil pan, and that's what's going to suck the oil out of the sump, which is why we call it a dry sump, and put it back into this tank. The other options, sometimes we'll do a 5-stage or a 6-stage. Sometimes in some cars, they'll either pull oil out of lifter valleys on a V8, or pull oil out of heads, things like that. Places where oil tends to accumulate that you want to try to get it out of the motor.
So the scavenge pumps, to kind of define what that is, that's where you're pulling oil from the engine and actually putting it back into the tank so that your pressure section can move it from the tank back into the engine.
Yep.
So you're actively moving oil in both directions.
Right. And the other thing the scavenge stages do is they also help move air from the motor. So in any engine, you're going to get a certain amount of leak past the rings. Like that's just going to happen. It happens more in forced induction applications.
Sure.
So at any time, these 3 stages are not moving just oil. They're also moving air back to the oil tank and allowing that air to percolate out of the oil and leave to atmosphere.
Okay, so you'd actually maybe even put a breather or some manner of breather on the oil tank, wherever it might be located, to release that pressure.
Yeah, usually there's a separate breather can that goes with the oil tank.
So it pretty much goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's a high level of customization to this kind of a system. This is not. There are some production cars that come with the dry sump system, but not very many.
No.
And so if you're going to put this on a car, there's a lot of customization involved. So I mean, we're talking about you have to locate the tank somewhere, find a place to locate the pump. The pump is still driven off of the engine.
It is.
But you're going to have to mount the pump somewhere where you can have a gear that drives off of a crank pulley or something like that to drive the pump itself. So this is probably not something that there's a reason that not every car comes with it. There's a lot more complexity to the oiling system when you go this far.
There is, but also it allows you to be very creative in how and really tune your oiling to the motor as it exists. Rather than relying on something else. You can really get a pump and a tank situation set up to your type of racing, type of car, type of engine, what you've done to that engine. So it allows you a lot of flexibility, within that complexity, and that's what makes it complex.
Sure. Well, so like you see a lot of stickers that say for race use only, but people are, get away with using them on street cars. This is something pretty much, when you say for race use only, it really means for race use only.
We've had some people put it on street cars, but then they quickly realize that there's a lot more maintenance involved in running a dry sump system. Oil changes become much more involved.
Yeah, 6 gallons of oil, that's a lot of oil,
Yeah.
especially if you want to run synthetic.
Yeah.
That's a very expensive oil change.
Yeah.
Okay. But, so there's complexity, there's some customization involved. You've got to set it up for your engine. But there's, because of all of the options that you now have with this, there's so many advantages to this type of system, dry sump oiling system, if you actually need that performance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about some of that.
Like we talked about with the wet sump system, in a high G corner on a road course, you're going to have the oil wants to climb the wall of the pan away from pickups. In a drag race situation, you're going to have oil that wants to run to the back of the pan and then suddenly to the front of the pan at the end of the line. When you have an oil tank like this, the reason why it's tall and round is to help keep that oil centered over the pickup. And the pickup in these actually goes down to the very bottom of these tanks.
Tip it here real quick.
So this is the pickup fitting here, but there's actually a tube inside that actually comes down to the very center.
And it's
So
even conical shapes. I mean,
it is. It helps keep that oil from wanting to climb the wall and get away from that pickup.
And the chances of, if you have this thing that's almost entirely full of oil, the chances of you being able to drain this and get it to the point where the pickup is starved is almost zero. Yeah.
And also the benefit of having multiple scavenge stages, same thing. You are going to have some residual oil in your sump. So by having multiple scavenge stages, you can set pickup points in your pan so that at least one of these stages is always going to be grabbing oil from your pan and sending it back to the tank.
Right. And these pumps, I mean, you can kind of tell they're somewhat modular. So if you wanted a 5-stage pump, a 6-stage pump, if you want to be able to pull oil back from, like if you have a Subaru that has 2 heads that are flat and oil can sit in those heads, you can have a scavenge pump for each one of them, plus, the sump, and then, a couple other locations if you actually wanted to.
Yeah, we've actually built a 9-stage pump for a tractor puller that had 3 pressure sections and 6 scavenge sections.
Wow.
Had 1 pressure section for the motor, 1 each for each of the turbos, which are huge.
Yeah.
And then they were also scavenging the turbos and scavenging the motor.
So you can actually have a scavenge section on a turbo. So you're actively moving the oil from the turbo back to the pan directly.
Yeah, usually on very large turbos.
Sure. These are industrial strength tractor pull turbos.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
A little bit overkill for a Subaru.
Yeah.
Cool. So there's tons of customization. What about just the control of pressure and volume that this type of system allows you for how you're feeding oil into the engine?
Yeah, it has the same benefits of the wet sump, external wet sump that we talked about, where it does have an external regulator so that you can adjust your pressure to your motor's needs.
Okay.
And we also can size sections. We have different width rotors, so we can size the pressure section, the pumping sections, to the oil needs of the engine. If you're running, like for instance, dirt late models, which is a little out of the Subaru realm.
Right. Yes.
The dirt late models tend to run a lot of clearance in the motor, so they might be up 15, 16 gallons a minute of needs of the oil in the motor, where a Subaru motor might be around 6 gallons a minute.
Right. So like dirt late models, it's a V8.
It's a big V8.
Big V8.
It's a 400 cubic inch V8.
Sure. So if you know what basically the oil demands are of the engine itself, and what RPM you're going to be in, you can actually take that information and calculate, well, this is the speed that the rotor is going to need to be spinning, and so you can do the gear reduction. And then you can change the size of the rotor so you have enough volume to supply whatever the demands of the engine would be.
Right.
So you can, it will require some math, but you can actually get this pump to be perfectly suited to the engine that you're running in the conditions that it's running in.
Yeah, and I mean we've done everything from little 1.8 turbo 4 cylinders to up to 6-liter diesel motors, 6-liter 6-cylinder. Huge V8 mountain motor drag race stuff. I mean, it's and because the pump's modular, you can build it to meet the oil needs for those motors.
So and again, just to highlight kind of some of the engines. I mean, you've done like Honda drag cars, like so kind of like sport compact drag cars, like big V8 drag cars, NASCAR, obviously, off-road stuff, endurance racing. I mean, so this kind of system can be applicable to just about any kind of racing application.
Yeah.
Once you do the math and figure out what you need, Peterson Fluid Systems could put together whatever pump matches those needs.
Yeah, and I mean, we even help people all the time figure out what they need for their motors. I mean, it's not something necessarily somebody's got to figure out on their own. It's something they can call us up and say, this is the motor I have,
Right,
this is what
right.
I'm doing with it, what do I need for my system?
Unfortunately, because you guys do this day in and day out, like I said with the Subaru engine, your guess was 6 gallons per minute. You guys have helped people with Subarus build dry sump systems.
Yeah, it would
so you
be-
have a baseline of information of like, well, this is probably the ballpark that you're going to be in.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Let's talk about living with a dry sump system. Because
Okay.
that's one of the things, people hear dry sump, we know what it is. There's a handful of cars that come with dry sump systems, like some of the new Corvettes have them, the 911 Turbos have had them in relatively recent history, for example. But when you're putting it on a car yourself, what kind of things do you need to know about just living with the dry sump system and getting it to work just every time you go out to start the car?
Yeah. So a few things you have to consider. If you're trying to do this in a car that you're going to use on a regular basis, one would be the venting of the tank. Make sure you get that vented safely to somewhere outside the car. There's a lot of oil fumes that come out of these, and you want to make sure that you're safe. And in a race car, where the whole inside's open and there's a lot of air flowing through it, you don't have to worry about as much. If you're using this on something that you want to maybe drive on a regular basis and then you go use it on track days and stuff like that,
Right.
make sure that the tank is well vented.
Okay.
Another thing you have to watch out for is these will tend to backflow through the pump when they sit.
Okay.
So when you have this tall column of oil
Right.
sitting over the pickup, gravity will tend to try to push that back out. It will run through the pump because there is a little bit of clearance and back into the pan.
Okay.
When it's trying to pull oil, when you go on startup and it's trying to pull oil from the tank and there's no oil in the tank because you're waiting for the pump to get it back to the tank,
Right.
you can have some startup issues there. And that's why we've done stuff like this is a primer that we've created that's a remote oil filter.
Okay.
But you can mount your oil filter to it, spin this over with a drill, it'll prime the motor up, it'll get that oil on all your bearings, and then you don't have to worry about it. So some other ways that you can do that is you can take the pulley off of or take the belt off of the pump
Right.
and spin the pump over with a drill. We make a little piece that
Okay.
screws into the end of the shaft, and you can screw it
So
over
manually
that.
spin the oil pump and the scavenger section, so you're moving the oil back to the pan and you're priming the oil into the engine.
Yeah. So that's something, if the car's going to sit for 2 or 3 days, you want to do that. I mean, it's not
Sure.
something you can just jump in and fire it up without having some wear on the engine.
Right. So back to for race use only, there is a little bit of priming that you're going to want to do every time you start this up. So again, it's you don't want to do that every time you have to run to the store for milk or
Yeah.
something. So let's also talk about the filter, because
Yeah.
the filter location. I mean, you're going to be taking to put this on a car that didn't come with it. You're going to be taking the majority of the oiling system off of the engine and basically remote locating it. And one of those things too is the oil filter.
Sure. This is one of our inline filters. Now you can do a remote screw-on filter like this, or you can use one of our inline filters, which is a stainless steel screen mesh inside, which means it's cleanable, which is nice. If whenever you go for an oil change or something like that, you just take this out, clean the element off in a parts washer, put it back in.
Right. Right.
But this is meant for, again, race use. I mean,
Right,
this is what most, if not all, race cars have this style of filter on it.
Okay.
Anything you see, again, going back to NASCAR, IndyCar, Formula One, anything is going to have this kind of oil filter on it.
Gotcha.
Some use a spin-on filter, and those work fine. I mean,
Right. There's some advantages to using kind of a metal filter media versus like something like a paper or cotton filter media.
You can hold, in these kind of oil filters, if it's rated at a 60 micron, every hole in there is 60 micron.
More consistent.
It's very consistent, where in a paper filter, it tends to be a range.
Right. And it can be cleanable, which is also
And it's cleanable.
But of course, you still have to replace the oil.
You
So
do still have to replace all the oil.
It can be a lot.
It
A lot,
can
as you
be.
see. So,
It
okay.
can be.
So the Dry Sump Oiling System, it basically just gives you a lot of customization, but then a lot of benefits as far as your control of the oil pressure and ability to actually actively move oil from the engine back to the sump and such.
Yeah, and it's also, another benefit we haven't even touched on is what the oil's actually doing in the motor.
Okay.
So when you have, in a wet sump situation, you have the oil in the pan, it's
Right.
being subjected to hurricane level winds.
Right.
You have pistons moving,
Right.
you have rods moving, you have a crank swinging, you
Sure.
have all of this going on, and there's a lot, it tends to froth the oil.
Okay.
If you ever see oil in a pan when a motor's running, it looks like a milkshake.
Okay.
It becomes very light colored, a lot of air gets beaten into it. A benefit of a dry sump system is you take all of that away.
Gotcha.
You put the oil back into a tank like this where it can help de-aerate the oil. Yeah, there's several plates in here that the oil actually spins on, helps release that air. Again, that's why we have vapor coming out of these
Sure.
breather lines.
Sure.
And the nice thing about that is you can also make the oil pan much smaller, so you can tend to move move the whole engine down in the chassis to get better.
Sure. Lower center of gravity. Yeah. More mounting locations for the engine itself.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots of benefits to it. A little bit, definitely not something that you want to do every single time if it's your daily driver. But like for a race car, this level of startup procedure is pretty normal. I mean, there's other things like diff coolers and all sorts of things that can require a little bit of prep to use, but then you get so much benefit for longevity.
You do.
And now you've got an oiling system that is going to perfectly supply your engine in the conditions that you're going to be running it. And that's the underlying, that's the big reason you do all this.
Yeah, a properly set up oiling system will increase longevity in your race motor. It will increase its consistency. It's just better all around. If you're racing and your class allows it and your pocketbook allows it,
Yep.
dry sump is the absolute way to go.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for the information, Mike. Appreciate it. And stay tuned for more Flatiron Tuning Tech Tips.